Hello and welcome back to our study of the Gospel of John. Today we'll be in chapters 18 and chapter 19, at least part of it. His time had come. Over and over we have been reading about Jesus that his time had not yet come. He was with those people that were against him and wanted his life, but they weren't able to lay hands on him because it says his time had not yet come. And then other times it tells us that Jesus avoided certain places because he knew that those who wanted to take his life would be there. And he did it because it says his time had not yet come. But now his time had come. His time for going to the cross, paying the penalty for our sins. And that time that we're picking up on now is in the last moment of his life, really the last half day of his life. And it's evening. This is what it says in chapter 18. When Jesus had finished praying, you recall that he was with his disciples. They're having that last meal together, and he instructed them about some things, and then we're told that he prayed for himself, for his disciples, and for us, those who would put their faith in him after that. After he had finished doing this, he left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. So that means that he's now on the Mount of Olives. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and the disciples went into it. And of course, is Gethsemane, which was just that. It was an olive grove there on the Mount of Olives. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. This was the time of Passover. At that time, there would be many Jewish people who would go to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. There wasn't enough place for them to all stay in Jerusalem, so many would camp out. And it seems that Jesus and the disciples camped out on the Mount of Olives. It tells us that in Luke's Gospel, that Jesus was often there when he was in Jerusalem. He would stay on the Mount of Olives in maybe some sort of temporary shelter. And that's why Judas would know where Jesus was. So Judas came to the grove, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Well, we would understand that he would have some Jewish leaders there with him as he's seeking to take Jesus. The soldiers, who were these soldiers? Were these Jewish soldiers part of the temple guard, or were they Roman soldiers? We're not sure, and there's arguments on both sides for one or the other. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Torches and lanterns because it was dark. Weapons because maybe they didn't know what to face. Maybe they thought some people would rise up and support Jesus. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Knowing it all. None of this is taking Jesus by surprise. He knows what's about to take place. This is part of God's perfect will for Jesus' life at this time, that he will go to the cross and how it is that he'll get there. "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there with him. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Wow. The power of his "I am" knocked them to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you that I am he," Jesus answered. "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." That's maybe why Jesus said, "Who are you looking for?" Just so that they would zero in on the fact that it's not these. He was trying to protect those that are with him, his disciples. This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. I have not lost one of those you gave me. Remember, John, he said that back in John 6:39. So again, a fulfillment of what had been prophesied. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. This is recorded in all four Gospels, but it's only in this one that his name is mentioned as being Malchus, the high priest's servant. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Again, we know that the cup here that Jesus has been given to drink, Jesus is referring to the cross, his crucifixion. Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it would be good if one man died for the people. So Caiaphas was the high priest, and you remember earlier how he had said it's good that one man would die for the people, but he meant it in one way, in terms of let's get rid of this person here and let him die rather than the whole Jewish nation would suffer because of him. On the other hand, we know that there's truth in what Caiaphas said, because it was good that Jesus would die, because he would die for not the reason Caiaphas was thinking about, but for the forgiveness of sins. So this Jesus, first of all, goes to Annas' place. Now, Annas had been the high priest, and then his sons had been the high priests, but now at this point in time, his son-in-law, Caiaphas, was the high priest. Jesus actually would have 3 separate Jewish trials, if you like, and followed by 3 civil trials. They're not all contained in one gospel, but at the very end of our session today, we will just name what those 6 are. And this seems to be sort of almost a screening time when Annas is going to try to see if Jesus might say something that would incriminate himself. We're going to get to that in a moment. But first we're back to Simon Peter, because we're told that Simon Peter also went into the court at this time, but that you know what's going to happen. But let's read it. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. Many people think that that's the gospel writer John, who knew the high priest and was able to get into the courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, probably John, came back, spoke to the girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" the girl at the door asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." Why did she ask that question? Is there something about Peter's appearance, or maybe his Galilean accent, that caused her to think that? It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep them warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. This is a part of the year where it would be cold in Jerusalem in the evening. There would be a fire. People would be warming themselves around the fire. And maybe Peter made his way over to the fire, partly because he might have been cold, and maybe partly because he just wanted to sort of blend in and not be so conspicuous. Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. So Annas now is sort of going to ask Jesus a question or two to try to sort out what Jesus might say, and might, in the process, incriminate himself by saying so. Listen to Jesus. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. So Jesus' response to the high priest is, why are you asking me this question? You should know the answer. I've been very open about speaking. I've spoken in many places where people have heard me. Go ask them what I've said. When Jesus said this, however, one of the officials nearby struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. We're going to talk about the different ways that Jesus was abused during these moments, this last half day of his life. And here's one of them. He was struck in the face. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest. But before that happens, as Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, you too, you are not one of his disciples, are you? So here's a second question now by somebody asking him the question about whether he's a disciple of Jesus. And you remember how Peter said, others may deny you, but I won't. He denied it, saying, I am not. And he probably said it with that kind of vigor. One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove? Wow, here's a man who may have witnessed his relative having his ear cut off by Peter. Again, Peter denied it. And at that moment, a rooster began to crow. And didn't Jesus say that? That when you deny me, crow is going to, a rooster is begin to crow. And remember from the other gospel, it says, Peter realized what he had just done, and he went out and wept bitterly about it. Now Jesus is before Caiaphas. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, what charges are you bringing against this man? So first, Jesus is with Annas. Then he goes to Caiaphas. We're not told about that meeting in John's Gospel. But Caiaphas has this, Jesus is on trial before Caiaphas, if you like. And then ultimately, the Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, meet and they decide, okay, Jesus has said enough. We want his life. But as Jews, we don't have the ability to take his life. It's going to tell us that in a moment. And so that's the reason why they bring him to Pilate. Now, this is interesting. But they don't want to go into the palace and meet with Pilate because they will be ceremonially unclean. Pilate's a Gentile. If they go there, they're going to be ceremonially unclean. They're not going to be able to celebrate the Passover. This is extraordinary. On the one hand, they're worried about that. On the other hand, they're not worried about taking Jesus' life, somebody they know who hasn't done anything. So they won't go in. Pilate comes out and he asks, what charges have you that you bring this man to me? If he were not a criminal, they replied, we would not have handed him over to you. Okay, so now they're saying to Pilate, he's a criminal. Do something about it. Pilate said, take yourself and judge him by your own law. This is the way it worked. The Jews were in command. But what they did was they allowed, I said that wrong. The Romans were in command. Okay, this is the Roman Empire. This is a Roman province. The Romans are in command, and Pilate is the governor of that area. So he's at the top. But the Romans allowed the Jews to judge people according to their law and to take action as they would want. Took some stress off them to do that. The response says, "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. That's why they're here. The Jews have the right to judge according to their laws, but they don't have the ability to take somebody's life. That's why they're bringing Jesus to Pilate. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken indicating the kind of death was going to die would be fulfilled. The way that the Jews would take somebody's life if they had the ability was by stoning. But the Romans, the way they did it was by crucifixion. And it was by crucifixion that Jesus' life end would have been prophesied to happen. And so all of this is happening. The Jews bringing Jesus to the Romans because they don't have the right for capital punishment, but the Romans being able to provide the right kind of capital punishment, crucifixion, that will fulfill Scripture. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" They were saying some things to Pilate that aren't recorded here, and one of them has to do with about his being a king. And Pilate's asking this question probably because even though Pilate really isn't interested in Jesus, the one thing that he has to be certain as a Roman is that Jesus is not going to bring an insurrection against Rome. Now, if he claims to be a king, well, that's possible. So that could be behind what Pilate is asking here. "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your own people and your chief priest who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world." Two things. First of all, we as believers need to realize that this kingdom, this world in which we live in, this ultimately isn't God's kingdom. God's kingdom is in the hearts of all the people who honor God, for whom he is supreme and where God has authority. But this also would lie Pilate's fears, because he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." So he doesn't deny being a king, but he says, "My kingdom is not of this world." So you don't have to worry, Pilate. "If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews. But now my kingdom is from another place." Another place. "You are a king then?" said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world to testify to the truth." So Jesus does not respond to Pilate by saying, "I'm not a king," as you just suggested I might be. I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. I came into the world to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me. "What is truth?" Pilate asked. What is truth? Well, that's one of those sayings that people remember about Pilate. How did he say that, though? Did he say that facetiously? Did he say it scornfully? Or with impatience, or was it a sincere response? Or was he thinking other things and he just repeated what Jesus said? Not sure. With this, he went out to the Jews and said, I find no basis for a charge against him. So Pilate has had this private time with Jesus, asked him some questions. Jesus has responded, and Pilate is looking at Jesus, doesn't understand him when he talks about kingdoms of another world, but he's saying to himself, this man is no threat to Rome. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? So Pilate is now thinking, how am I going to get out of this? Okay, well, I'll act as if I am doing the Jewish nation a favor by releasing somebody to them, one of their own. This person, Jesus, who is the king of the Jews, as they're calling him. They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Now, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. That's amazing because Barabbas is somebody who had caused a problem with respect to rebelling. But they do not want Jesus free. They want his life. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Why? Well, hopefully, he thought, they might think, okay, I didn't just let him off. I did something to him. So maybe now they might take him back. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. Must have been very, very painful. They clothed him in a purple robe, like majesty. Purple was the color of kings. And went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him in the face. First he was slapped. Now he is struck. Thorns, the crown of thorns on his head. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, Here is the man. Well, at this point in time, Jesus, the crown of thorns on his head, maybe being slapped, bruised, disheveled, didn't look like his appearance would not be that of a king or anybody that, well, I don't want to use the word, but he may not have looked good at all. As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, Crucify, crucify. Now, they weren't going to be ameliorated by something like that, placated by something like that. But Pilate answered, You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. The Jews insisted, We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God. They're finally coming clean. They brought him to Pilate. They wanted Jesus' death. They weren't really suggesting the truth about Jesus, that he was going to cause some problem for Rome, and that's why Pilate should be concerned. It was really because of what they saw Jesus saying about himself, and they took it as blasphemy. This is the reason why they wanted his death. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize that I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Look at the scene. Here's Pilate. He's probably dressed like the governor that he was. There are probably soldiers around. Here's Jesus, having been struck, not looking in any way in a positive way. Jesus answered, "You have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Who is that? Caiaphas? Many think so. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." They knew, the Jews knew, what it is that Pilate could not get away from. He's the Roman governor. He cannot allow anything that would be against Caesar. That's where he had to be particularly careful if anyone were raising their hand against Caesar. When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of Passover week, about the 6th hour. It was Friday. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. How did he say that? Sarcastically? Probably. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. Now listen to this. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. They're now claiming that their king is Caesar. Well, if there's one thing that the Jews did not go for, it was the Romans being an authority and accepting that Caesar was their king. But they're after blood, Jesus' blood. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. Pilate gives in, knows it's wrong, but now all that's left is for Jesus to be led to crucifixion. Takeaway. Our focus, and rightly so as believers, has always been on the 6 hours that Jesus was nailed to a cross, from 9 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon. For it is during those moments that Jesus made atonement for our sins. That's when Jesus accomplished the task for which he was sent. He bore our sins on the cross and paid the full penalty for them. But the scriptures make it abundantly clear that the suffering that Jesus experienced during the 12 or so hours preceding the cross were unspeakable. This suffering included, and we've been reading about it today, last session, they included. These are the things that preceded Jesus going to the cross, the unspeakable things. The betrayal by one of the 12. That was Judas. Being deserted by the others, the other 11. Being denied by Peter, who said he would never deny Jesus. Having a crown of thorns placed on his head must have been excruciatingly painful. Being mocked, being slapped on the face by the high priest assistant, and being struck in the face by the soldiers, and being subjected. All of that's terrible. And being subjected to 6 trials that evening. Not all of them are in John's Gospel, not all in Matthew, not all in Mark, not all in Luke. But if you put the 4 Gospels together, then we learn about all the trials that Jesus experienced that last night. And here they are very quickly. First, before Annas. And we read about that in John chapter 18. Secondly, before Caiaphas. Matthew's Gospel tells us about that. Then before the Sanhedrin, when all of the leaders gathered together finally and made the decision that Jesus must die. Then before Pilate, when they bring him to Pilate, we read about this in John's Gospel, they bring him to Pilate and they say, Pilate, we want you to put him to death, really. Then before Herod, that's not in this Gospel, but it tells us that in Luke's Gospel, that Pilate sent Jesus from himself to Herod. And Jesus had a trial or an interview, if you like, before King Herod. And then back to Pilate in John chapter 18, verses 39 to what we just finished when Pilate decided on Jesus' crucifixion. Then we learn of that last one. So 3 occasions then in these last hours. Jesus has 3 Jewish religious trials, if you like, or trials before the religious establishment, and then 3 civil trials, 2 with Pilate and 1 with Herod. All of this preceding those 6 hours that Jesus was on the cross. The point again, those 6 hours were terrible. And on those 6 hours, Jesus provided for the atonement for sin. But the 12 hours preceding that were unspeakable. Last thought. As terrible as all of these things are, all of these things happened either because of the permissive will of God or according to his sovereign will. Which is to say that this was God's plan. This was God's plan that Jesus would suffer and die. And while at the same time, the people who do these things, Pilate, Judas, other high priests, all of this, Caiaphas, are held responsible personally for what they did. God be with you. Have a good day.